At 16, Mr. Frederick Douglass was somewhat bold in his interactions with Master Thomas. He lived with him for roughly 9 months, and he received numerous severe whippings, which did not result in any improvement in his submissiveness or obedience. So Master Thomas eventually became fed up with this behavior, and in his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, Mr. Douglass tells us at this point he was sent off to be broken, and it happened like this.
There was, in the Bayside, very near the campground where my master got his religious impressions, a man named Edward Covey, who enjoyed the execrated reputation of being a first-rate hand at breaking young Negroes.
What does it mean to break Negroes? That means to get them to completely submit to the will of their master. It's the removal of any attitude, boldness, resistance, independence, and impudence out of a Negro slave. And Edward Covey was a man who enjoyed the reputation of being very good at doing this.
This Covey was a poor man, a farm renter, and this reputation, hateful as it was to the slaves and to all good men, was, at the same time, of immense advantage to him.
Here's how.
It enabled him to get his farm tilled with very little expense, compared with what it would have cost him without this most extraordinary reputation.
So for the master supplying labor to till his farm at very little expense, he would in return provide a well-behaved, submissive, and obedient servant.
Some slaveholders thought it an advantage to let Mr. Covey have the government of their slaves a year or two, almost free of charge, for the sake of the excellent training such slaves got under his happy management. Like some horse breakers, noted for their skill, who ride the best horses in the country without expense, Mr. Covey could have under him the most fiery bloods of the neighborhood for the simple reward of returning them to their owners, well broken.
You see that? Bring the biggest backtalker on the block to Mr. Covey, and he will return said Negro well broken. This was his reputation. Now let's get a little bit more background on this Covey, the Negro breaker.
Added to the natural fitness of Mr. Covey for the duties of his profession, he was said to enjoy religion, and was as strict in the cultivation of piety as he was in the cultivation of his farm.
He was also in the Lord and had a personal relationship with Jesus, just like Master Thomas did while he was beating Henny, his disabled slave. So we know that Covey, being a religious person, probably made things worse, especially if he was breaking Negroes in the name of the Lord.
I was made aware of his character by some who had been under his hand, and while I could not look forward to going to him with any pleasure, I was glad to get away from St. Michael's. I was sure of getting enough to eat at Covey's, even if I suffered in other respects. This, to a hungry man, is not a prospect to be regarded with indifference.
He's got food on his mind because at Master Thomas's house he was half starved, and he had to beg and steal to survive. So if he gets beat at Covey's place, at least he's well fed. And when someone is starving, a beating doesn't sound as bad as feeling the pinch of hunger. So it may well be worth the trade-off. Now, on January 1st, 1834, Mr. Douglass made off on the distant journey from Master Thomas's to Mr. Covey's. And his thoughts were,
I was now about to sound profounder depths in slave life. The rigors of a field, less tolerable than the field of battle, awaited me. My new master was notorious for his fierce and savage disposition, and my only consolation in going to live with him was the certainty of finding him precisely as represented by common fame. There was neither joy in my heart nor elasticity in my step as I started in search of the tyrant's home. Starvation made me glad to leave Thomas Auld's, and the cruel lash made me dread to go to Covey's. Escape was impossible. So, heavy and sad, I paced the 7 miles which separated Covey's house from St. Michael's, thinking much by the solitary way, averse to my condition, but thinking was all I could do.
And after walking some time, he came across a little wooded cabin about a mile's distance from where he was. And from the word on the plantation, this was the description that matched the house of Covey. It was freezing cold at that time, so he hastened his way over to the cabin. And now on the plantation,
the family consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Covey, Miss Kemp, a broken-backed woman, a sister of Mrs. Covey, William Hughes, cousin to Edward Covey, Caroline the cook, Bill Smith, a hired man, and myself. Bill Smith, Bill Hughes, and myself were the working force of the farm, which consisted of 300 or 400 acres. I was now, for the first time in my life, to be a field hand, and in my new employment I found myself even more awkward than a green country boy may be supposed to be upon his first entrance into the bewildering scenes of city life, and my awkwardness gave me much trouble.
Observe.
Strange and unnatural as it may seem, I had been at my new home but 3 days before Mr. Covey, my brother in the Methodist Church, gave me a bitter foretaste of what was in reserve for me. I presume he thought that since he had but a single year in which to complete his work, the sooner he began, the better. Perhaps he thought that by coming to blows at once we should mutually better understand our relations. But to whatever motive, direct or indirect, the cause may be referred, I had not been in his possession 3 whole days before he subjected me to a most brutal chastisement.
Covey got right to it, and as soon as Covey had some spare time on his hands, he got right to business. He didn't give Douglass time to get comfortable and get familiar with the place or anything like that. What he gave him was a most brutal whipping.
Under his heavy blows, blood flowed freely and wales were left on my back as large as my little finger. The sores on my back from this flogging continued for weeks, for they were kept open by the rough and coarse cloth which I wore for shirting.
This is wild stuff.
The occasion and details of this first chapter of my experience as a field hand must be told that the reader may see how unreasonable as well as how cruel my new master Covey was.
One time, Covey put Mr. Douglass in charge of these 2 untamed oxen to go out into the forest and retrieve some fire logs. Upon returning, as he was passing through the gate entry, which only was able to open halfway, one of the oxen got wild and it burst forward in full speed. It pulled the cart into the gate and it broke it. Mr. Douglass then went to go and tell Covey what happened and how wild the ox had got. And by the time Covey came to see the ox, it was on its best behavior. And this made Covey hot. And what did he do? He went over to the tree, took off a branch, and with his switch in hand,
he ordered me to take off my clothes. To this unreasonable order I made no reply, but sternly refused to take off my clothing. If you will beat me, thought I, you shall do so over my clothes.
This is why he got sent to Covey in the first place. Too much resistance on his part. When they say something, they expect it to be done without a second thought. Mr. Douglass wasn't going for taking off his clothes, which is why,
after many threats which made no impression on me, he rushed at me with something of the savage fierceness of a wolf, tore off the few and thinly worn clothes I had on, and proceeded to wear out, on my back, the heavy goads which he had cut from the gum tree. This flogging was the first of a series of floggings, and though very severe, it was less so than many which came after it, and these for offenses far lighter than the gate breaking. I remained with Mr. Covey 1 year. I cannot say I lived with him, and during the first 6 months that I was there, I was whipped, either with sticks or cowskins, every week. Aching bones and a sore back were my constant companions. Frequent as the lash was used, Mr. Covey thought less of it as a means of breaking down my spirit than that of hard and long-continued labor. He worked me steadily, up to the point of my powers of endurance. From the dawn of day in the morning till the darkness was complete in the evening, I was kept at hard work, in the field or the woods. At certain seasons of the year we were all kept in the field till 11 and 12 o'clock at night. At these times Covey would attend us in the field and urge us on with words or blows, as it seemed best to him. He had, in his life, been an overseer, and he well understood the business of slave driving. There was no deceiving him. He knew just what a man or boy could do, and he held both to strict account.
This was hard bondage under Covey. This is what earned him the reputation as the Negro breaker. He attempted to break every bit of a person's being. And the question is, was he able to break Douglass? We're going to find out soon.
If at any one time of my life, more than another, I was made to drink the bitterest dregs of slavery, that time was during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey. We were worked all weathers. It was never too hot or too cold. It could never rain, blow, snow, or hail too hard for us to work in the field. Work, work, work was scarcely more the order of the day than the night. The longest days were too short for him, and the shortest nights were too long for him. I was somewhat unmanageable when I first went there.
He wasn't being a good slave. That's why Thomas sent him to Covey.
But a few months of his discipline tamed me.
Uh-oh.
Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me.
He got him. He succeeded in breaking down even the great Mr. Douglass. Everybody's got a breaking point, and Covey found his. That's why he says,
I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me. And behold, a man transformed into a brute.
He was defeated. The undertaker brought him down to the very bottom of the pit. And when he lifted up his eyes, he realized,
I am left in the hottest hell of unending slavery. O God, save me. God, deliver me. Let me be free. Is there any God? Why am I a slave? I will run away. I will not stand it. Get caught or get clear, I'll try it.
He would have to do something about it or remain a slave under these conditions. And if we know anything about Douglass, we should know that he already decided a long time ago that he was not going to be a slave. But before he earned his freedom, there was still more of the Negro breaker that he would have to endure.